YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Flickr, a technological revolution in the realm of journalism. Social media played an important, maybe even historic role in Iran's post-election debacle. But in the process, did it bite off a chunk of conventional media authority? And have the rules of journalism been irreversibly bent to open the way for new media? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Sahil Rahman. Welcome to the programme. It is Journalism 101. Check your sources, verify their credibility before you publish. But during the latest chaos in Iran, many Western media organisations adopted a different approach. Publish first, verify later. Was it because of the media blackout imposed by the Iranian authorities? Or was it because it's Iran and considering the mutually hostile relations it has with the West? The June the 12th election aftermath took many by surprise. President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was declared the winner against opposition leader Mir Hossein Mousavi. Disputes over the result led to protests and clashes, making it a news headline. Within a matter of 4 days, Iranian authorities clamped down on foreign media. Several foreign correspondents were sent away, while others were severely restricted in their movements and reporting. This created a news vacuum for the world, which was quickly filled up by unconventional sources such as YouTube, Twitter, blogs and mobile phone pictures. They became Iran's vital means of communication among themselves and a lifeline to the outside world. The Western media was forced to heavily rely on these sources, and the information available was limited and often the source and authenticity hard to verify. This led the Iranian leadership to accuse the Western media of fueling the crisis. Well, joining us today are our guests in London, Bakar Moin, who is the former head of the BBC Persian service and author of the book Khomeini, Life of the Ayatollah. Also in London, Abbas Edilat, founder of the Campaign Against Sanctions and Military Intervention in Iran and a professor at the Imperial College in London. And in New York, Brian Stelter, reporter at the New York Times. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Human rights and democracy activists have collected 12 names of the martyrs of the post-election protests in Tehran. This in addition to the 14 names released before. My source? It's a blog, an Iranian blog. There you go. I just reported it to the world now and to you three. How do I verify that that report is true, especially considering the hands of foreign media, including Al Jazeera's, are tied in Iran? How much truth do we take from this? Brian, can I put it to you first?
I think there's a new form of authentication and fact-checking that's taking place that I think journalists and bloggers are trying to learn, sometimes doing it right and sometimes doing it wrong. And this new form of authentication sometimes comes from having multiple, hopefully independent eyewitnesses, even if those eyewitnesses have a clear stake in the outcome. And so in a case like this, I would say you'd be looking for other sources to corroborate it, but even that's not perfect.
Bakar Moin, what's your opinion of that?
Well, I agree. I think the technology has taken over from the brain of journalists at the moment worldwide. But in the case of Iran, it was very much in evidence because the authorities limited the activities of journalists to verify stories. Also, I think one has to understand the background of Iran in a sense. President Ahmadinejad has made himself very unpopular among the Western media and specifically pro-Israeli groups across the globe because of his outrageous statement and factual statements. Sometimes it depends on the kind of statement he's been making. I think that is one factor. The second factor which made the story very appealing to the media, of course, was the technology-savvy Iranians who filled the gap once the authorities clamped down on journalists and also imposed, in a sense, their own agenda on Western journalism. Verifying is very difficult. We always used to say that being late is much better than being wrong, and being accused of omission is better than being accused of commission. I think these rules are going away because of the technology. I think we have to be prepared now for the technology, for the raw material that is coming and being used. I think we have to look at it in a very sober manner. Forget the case is Iran, because tomorrow it may be Saudi Arabia, it may be Egypt, maybe another country in Latin America. Yeah. We may face exactly the same situation.
Let me just bring in Abbas Edilat here. It's very embarrassing for any media organisation to apologise for their mistakes, especially when it's news coverage. Abbas, are the rules different for Iran when it comes to dealing with Iran now because of the way that the world looks at Iran and the way Iran looks at the outside world, especially in the way that they conduct themselves politically?
Absolutely, absolutely they are. Because remember, 3 years ago, there was the allegation of a stolen election in Mexico, and there was no major fuss in the Western media or by the Western governments about it. There was no condemnation. There were protests for a few weeks and it just died out. In Iran, we've got a government which has been demonized by the Western media, justifying sanctions and the threat of military intervention against it for some 4 years now. And now comes this election, and the Western media jumps on the bandwagon of portraying a picture of a velvet revolution in Iran, despite the fact that Mr. Mousavi, whom I voted for, I should say this for transparency, has said very categorically that he and also Mr. Karoubi has said that they're both faithful, loyal to the tenets of the Islamic Republic, to the Islamic Revolution, and they only seek legal ways of making protests. And in fact, they have cancelled any demonstration which they couldn't get permission from the Interior Ministry. So the Western media came, and this is much before any restriction was imposed by the Iranian government. The Western media came, portrayed a false picture of what was going on, and in fact, it focused on these extremist elements who resorted to violence, burning buses, burning motorcycles, and so on, that the Mousavi leadership condemned categorically. None of this was really portrayed in an objective way. And I think in this way, the BBC, the Western media in general, completely failed its objectivity and reliability of its coverage of the Iranian events.
Well, let me just bring in Mr. Moyne here again. Let's not mention the BBC as such, but international media outlets. The Iranians are able to control their state media, there's no doubt about that. But do you think that the international media failed in distinguishing the parameters in which Mr. Mousavi operates? He would still describe himself as a supporter of the Iranian Revolution, yet he was given the label of being a modernizer, which some could interpret as being a revolutionary in Western terms and anti-Iranian within the borders of Iran.
I think Mr. Mousavi really made it very clear that he wants to change from within the Islamic revolution, to go back to the principles of the Islamic Republic and its constitution that he said has been ignored or undermined by the past practices. However, I think as events moved on, everything not was under his control. My point as far as the news is concerned, I think possibly the news gathering wings of all media could have paid more attention to the government side in reflecting at least what they are saying. I think all of us were overwhelmed by what was coming out of Tehran in terms of raw but real pictures that was emotionally very, very attractive. I think this is a point that I was going to mention, that we need really to look at it as journalists. How are we going to deal with similar situation when it comes to another country in the near future? Because we are moving into fast area of digital revolution for which we are not prepared. I was sent a number of packages that were already either on YouTube or other places, but they had been doctored. One specifically was that Mr. Ahmadinejad met Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi, his supposed spiritual leader, in Qom a day before the crackdown, while we discovered that it was 2 years back. So I think there was a lot of doctoring of various raw material, and also emotionally charged stories that may not have any foundation. I think we need to prepare ourselves as journalists for similar situation, to be able to decipher between what is new and what is not. And going back to some of the old methodology of journalism, I think would help us all.
But of course, that is very difficult in the modern technological age. Brian Stelton, I just bring you in here as a reporter for the New York Times. A lot of the reporting came from Tehran, from the capital. We saw very little from inner Iran. Does that reflect the support bases for both of the candidates? Because a lot of the, as you say, media-savvy, technological-savvy Iranians that did contact the international media seemed to be Mousavi supporters, and yet we didn't see as much from Ahmadinejad supporters. Does that reflect the way that their support base is seen within Iran?
I think it reflects something interesting going forward, as the other guest was saying, about covering situations like this in the future. It actually puts a bit more of the burden on the activists on each side to get their own story out, to be posting their own YouTube videos, to be posting their own photos on Flickr and on Facebook. I'd actually flip it, and I would say it creates more. It puts the activists in this position of having to report on themselves in a way that we haven't seen before. And in this case, the supporters for Mousavi were certainly doing more of their own quote-unquote reporting. They were doing more of their own storytelling, and journalists were trying to filter all of those videos.
Sure,
I do think, though, the fact that most journalists were in Tehran did, in some ways, put more emphasis on the coverage from the capital city. And I think it's notable that the reason there were so many journalists there in the first place was because they were all able to get these one-week visas for the election. If they hadn't been in the country, there would have been a lot less reporting than we actually saw.
We'll just hold that thought, all of you gentlemen, and Brian as well. Western media does make mistakes. There is little denying that. As discussed earlier on, foreign media was forced to rely on information found on the internet. Apart from the obvious problem of authenticity, they failed to take into account that the information on the internet was provided by Iranians who are educated and web savvy. Ahmadinejad supporters, for the most part, are not, and this tilts the content online towards a particular viewpoint, which may not necessarily be that of the majority. In addition, it is hard to contextualise the information found online or their implications. Also, the protests in Tehran, again, do not represent the opinion of the entire nation, especially considering Ahmadinejad is particularly popular in the rural areas of Iran. In addition, the Western media fail to distinguish between those against the regime and those for reform, painting them all with the same brush, including the supporters of the former Shah of Iran and Mousavi himself. Abbas Edilat, Annabelle Subraini of the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London has said on Al Jazeera's Listening Post programme that the Iranians don't understand the way Western media works. Is that an accurate statement, or is it the other way around?
Well, I think only 30% of Iranians use the internet. Only a small percentage of Iranians, especially in the rural areas and in poor urban areas, have got satellite dishes to access, for example, the BBC, CNN, or even Al Jazeera. So I think it's fair to say that the main constituency of Mr. Ahmadinejad does not know about the Western media, is somewhat suspicious of Western media, and therefore is not going to play an active role in reporting to the Western media of how it sees the situation. So therefore, it's not just a matter of how the matter is reported by activists in Iran, as Mr. Stelton has said. I think there's also a framed discourse within the Western media. I give you just one very telling example. At its crucial sermon, Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, a week after the election, said that the UK is actually guilty of treachery, and the Western media covered this in detail, but it failed to mention that the day before, the House of Commons in London, the government announced in the House of Commons in London that the British government is freezing nearly £1 billion of Iranian assets. So this was an extremely provocative statement by the British government just a day before this crucial sermon. and it wasn't reported at all by the Western media. So here is the source of the problem, that the Iranian government sees the Western media as biased, just reporting half of the story, just reporting what it wants to give the picture of a sort of velvet revolution, something that even the Mousavi leadership completely denies and denounces.
Well, Brian, can I bring you in here from New York? I mean, how much responsibility do you think now international media organisations, both television, internet, radio, newspapers, should take in being able to responsibly use this new form of media that's now there for everyone to use?
Mm-hmm. I think what we saw come out in June was extraordinary from a number of media organizations who are trying to figure out that answer, who are trying to figure out how they can sort through all of this, citizen content. Most of it is clearly partisan. It's not objective. It's not even trying to be objective. It's photos and videos and stories. Some of them are true, some of them are false. What we saw the New York Times, the Guardian, the Huffington Post do, is create these blogs, almost around the clock, trying to sort out these videos. Sometimes they would post a video and say, we don't know what day this is from. We can't confirm this is in Iran, but it appears to be in Iran. It appears to be from today. And then the readers would help try to figure that out by identifying landmarks in the video and by trying to confirm whether those videos have been posted before. I think that kind of collaboration between the audience and the journalist is something we're going to see more and more. And it's not a perfect solution, because unless you have a professional eyewitness on the ground at a rally, you're not going to have 100% confidence in the material. But I think that collaboration with the readers was an attempt to be as accurate as they could possibly be.
Bakar Moin, as former head of the BBC's Persian service, it's not just about portraying the story itself, it's the translation, isn't it, as well? And we saw the Iranian authorities close down, for example, the BBC's Persian service because they weren't happy with the way events were being translated. That's another issue, isn't it, alongside trying to translate the images that we see on things like Twitter and Flickr and YouTube.
I think the fireman approach towards elections by the media as a whole hasn't been always very productive, because you're sending journalists to the ground who haven't been there, don't understand the culture really, they don't understand the background, the story, and we are prone to generalization. Look, when Mr. Khatami was elected, he got 70% of the vote, even in the countryside. It doesn't mean that the countryside are not supporting Mousavi or supporting him. I think we have to get away from this generalizations. My feeling is that there are quite a lot of supporters of Ahmadinejad who've got access to internet, as we saw them on Western television after the election, because they brought out to demonstrate against the BBC, and they were present on various programs.
Well, did the Iranian authorities shoot themselves in the foot by not allowing this debate to continue publicly? And that, as you say, by fire hosing it all down and clamping down on journalists, they've only vilified themselves and their own regime to an outside world looking in.
Absolutely. I think, look at the debates were fantastic. The debates between the candidates was a historic eye-openers for Iranians. They've never seen so much dirt coming out by the leading politicians about the country, about its past, about the revolution and so forth. It was fascinating. They could have easily continued that and showed that, okay, there are debates within the country. So had the authorities in the radio and television gone for being open, people would not have to rely on Western television or Western radio and medias. I think I remember two areas, historically, if you look, during the revolution, especially when Bakhtiar was in power until they clamped down a year later on the media, number one, and number two, when Khatami came and allowed so many newspapers. In both cases, we as journalists were following what was happening in the Iranian media, not the other way around. So I think the Iranian authorities will have to get part of the blame for what they've done, but also I think the journalists will have to be much more prepared factually to understand and decipher what is happening, not only in Iran, but but for future cases.
Abbas Abdullah, can I just bring you in here to the credit of the Iranians? They did actually have television debates between all the candidates and the incumbent president. First, you might say, in many ways, it gave the Iranians the opportunity to see and hear what all of their candidates were saying. Again, you know, I'm going to ask you the same question. Did the Iranian regime shoot themselves in the foot when they actually clamped down on everything instead of having this debate much more in the open and being open about the results of the election?
Yes, I completely agree that what happened before the election was really a historic moment in Iran's and in the history of Islamic societies. We had this government minister in Indonesia saying that Iran is a vibrant democracy, is a model for the whole of the Islamic world. And even President Obama made a mention of that. So I completely agree that the pre-election events were going extremely well, and the government of Iran should not have curtailed democratic rights, including freedom of speech and freedom of press. But let's consider the main problem that the Iranian government has. You see, the UK and the US, pressured by the nuclear-armed Israel, they have created a state of siege in the country after 8 years of Bush's era. You see, they have imposed unjustified sanctions on the country, threatened this country with regime change, threatened the country even with a military intervention. They have organized covert operations to destabilize the Islamic Republic. They have supported actively even the terrorist opposition to the Iranian government. And therefore, in this state of siege, the Iranian government feels extremely fearful of a kind of velvet revolution by people who have any kind of political connection with the West, who may be supported by the West. And therefore, they resort to acts of curtailing democratic rights, which is not in the interest of Iran. It is not in the interest of Iranian people, and has to stop. I agree. But we have to consider that within this general context of the state of siege that the West, under the pressure of Israel, has created in Iran.
But it also, I see where you're coming from, but maybe that's a debate for another day, but it also brings into the fact that the Western media themselves portray, for example, let me just bring in the fact that Mir Hossein Mousavi was described as a pro-Western leader, a reformer. Let's rewind 20 years and look at what they had to say about him then. Now, in an article dated the 12th of January 1987, Time magazine labelled Mousavi a fervently anti-US radical. Brian Stelter, double standards then really, isn't it, from the Western media? When it suits them, he's fervently anti-US radical, and when it suits them, he's a reformer. Which is it?
I do think that over time that tone did change. I noticed a definite strand of the coverage in the first week of the protests, making clear that there were not all the differences there that some may have thought between the two candidates. It was a kind of counterintuitive pushback to the initial protest coverage. So you know, I'm not defending all of the coverage, but I do think it was made clear, perhaps later as the coverage went on, that you know, this candidate may not be the U.S.'s biggest dream or perfect person. However, you know, I think the emotion, the other guests were talking about, the drama of the video, made it a story that had to be covered. And I think in some ways the nuance of it and the knowledge and the context needed may explain why some of the best coverage early on was in newspapers and not on television. In fact, TV networks in the U.S. were criticized for not covering the protests enough, while newspapers had exhaustive coverage. And I think that speaks to the issue of having people on the ground with context and with background that can put it in perspective and make clear, for example, that Mousavi has been portrayed in the past as a candidate who would not be in line with U.S. policies or beliefs.
Well, we shall see what happens from there and in the future. I suppose the next question for another inside story is, can the media ever be fair, balanced and accurate with so much media available to us? Gentlemen, can I say, Bakar Moin, in London, Abbas Edilat also in London, and Brian Stelzer. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me on this edition of Inside Story. It's never enough time to discuss the issues, but I'm sure we'll have you all back again on this subject. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining me here on this edition of Inside Story. We do welcome your comments and suggestions. Please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Sahil Rahman. You've been watching Inside Story. Thank you for your time and your company.